Long before Christmas became a season of cozy fires and glowing windows, the Arctic Circle was a battlefield where survival hinged on a single, fragile degree of warmth. For the Sami and the northern settlers who followed, the question wasn't how to build a house, it was how to keep death out of it. Their solution emerged not from invention, but from a deep, instinctive understanding of the forest and the frozen earth. Over millennia, they transformed simple shelters into thermal machines. Sami Gowati dwellings layered birch bark and turf into living walls that fused with the soil. Later, as log houses spread across Lapland, builders mastered something even more radical, combining massive hewn timbers, airtight double-notched corners, and sphagnum moss chinking to create walls that trapped heat as effectively as modern insulation. Snow itself became an ally, banked against the exterior. It added insulation rivaling materials invented centuries later. These cabins weren't primitive. They were engineering achievements born from necessity. How did the people of Lapland turn wood, earth, and moss into super-insulated walls that defied Arctic winters long before the science of insulation even existed? Part 1. This is the edge of the inhabitable world, a place of stark beauty and unforgiving cold. For millennia, to live here was to wage a constant war against the elements. A war where the primary battle was not for territory or for glory, but for a single, precious degree of warmth. Long before the festive glow of Christmas defined these landscapes, survival in the Arctic Circle was a matter of engineering. It was a challenge met not with modern technology, but with an intimate understanding of the forest, the earth, and the fundamental physics of heat and cold. The story of how ancient builders conquered the northern winter is written in the walls of their homes. It is a story of innovation, resilience, and the quiet genius of creating super-insulated structures that could withstand the harshest conditions on Earth. These structures were not merely shelters, they were sophisticated thermal systems designed to capture, store, and preserve every precious calorie of heat in an environment where temperatures could plummet to 40 degrees below zero. Our story begins not with a single invention, but with a tradition stretching back nearly 6,000 years. Archaeological findings in northern Europe trace the origins of the log dwelling to as early as 3500 BC, during the Bronze Age. These were the first tentative steps in mastering wood as a building material. The vast forests of Scandinavia, dense with tall, straight pine and spruce, provided an ideal resource. These trees, shaped by centuries of slow growth in the harsh northern climate, developed dense wood with tight grain patterns that made them naturally resistant to rot and decay. But the true pioneers of Arctic architecture were the indigenous Sami people, whose lives were woven into the migratory patterns of the reindeer. By the 17th century, traditional Sami reindeer herding had become not just a livelihood, but a complete way of life, shaping their architecture and settlements. The Sami understood something fundamental about survival in the Arctic. Permanence was not always an advantage. Flexibility, adaptability, and an intimate knowledge of the landscape were far more valuable. Their earliest dwellings were not permanent fortresses against the cold, but elegant, adaptable solutions. The lavu, a portable, teepee-like tent, was a masterpiece of mobile design. Its wide base and low profile gave it stability against the fierce winds of the tundra, while its reindeer hide cover provided a crucial barrier against the elements. The lavu could be erected in less than an hour and dismantled just as quickly. It was a home that moved with the herd, a temporary sanctuary in a vast wilderness. The design was so effective that variations of it can still be found across the Arctic, from Siberia to northern Canada. For more seasonal settlements, the Sami developed the Gowati. This semi-permanent dwelling marked a critical step towards a more insulated existence. Its foundation was a sturdy wooden frame, often of birch, but its true innovation lay in its cladding. The builders would layer the frame with birch bark, a natural waterproof membrane that could be harvested without killing the tree. Birch bark contains natural oils that make it resistant to water and decay, properties that indigenous peoples across the Northern Hemisphere had discovered independently. Then they would cover the entire structure with a thick layer of turf, or sod, creating a living roof and walls. The goati was more than a hut. It was a living part of the landscape. The earth itself became the primary insulator. This technique, born of necessity, created a dwelling that was remarkably effective at retaining heat. It was a design that could last more than a decade, slowly melding with its surroundings, becoming more solid and stable with each passing season. As the grass on the roof continued to grow, its roots would weave through the turf blocks, binding them together into an increasingly weatherproof shell. But as log construction became more common across Scandinavia, a persistent enemy emerged: the draft. Even the tightest-fitting logs left gaps, tiny inlets for the relentless cold. A gap of just a few millimeters between logs could allow cold air to seep in and warm air to escape, dramatically reducing the thermal efficiency of the structure. The solution was found in the forest floor. As far back as the Viking Age, which began around the 8th century, builders in Norway began using one of nature's most effective insulators: moss. This process, known as chinking, was a pivotal moment in thermal engineering. Sphagnum moss, in particular, was ideal. When dry, it is light and full of air pockets, which are the key to any good insulator. When packed into the gaps between logs, it would expand and contract with the wood, creating a flexible, breathable seal that blocked drafts and kept moisture out. Unlike rigid materials, moss could accommodate the natural movement of the logs as they settled and responded to changes in temperature and humidity. A log wall is never truly static. It breathes with the seasons, expanding slightly in humid conditions and contracting in dry cold. It was a simple organic technology that transformed a drafty shelter into a truly weather-tight home. In some regions, builders would mix the moss with clay or even animal hair to create an even more durable seal. The technique was so effective that it remained the standard method of insulation for over 1,000 years, only being replaced by synthetic materials in the 20th century. This ancient blueprint, combining the structural strength of wood with the insulating power of earth and moss, laid the foundation for a building tradition that would define the North for centuries to come. Part 2. By the 9th century, a new wave of building knowledge was spreading across the region. The Finns, influenced by techniques from the East, particularly from Russian log-building traditions, began to master the art of the permanent log house. This marked a fundamental shift from the mobile lifestyle of the early Sami to the settled agricultural communities of the medieval period. By the 1200s, Finnish builders had refined these techniques to such a degree that log houses from this era still stand as testaments to their craftsmanship. The challenge was no longer just temporary survival, but year-round comfort in structures designed to last for generations, even centuries. The key to this evolution was the perfection of corner timbering. The strength and thermal integrity of a log house is determined not by the straight runs of timber, but by how they connect at the corners. Early builders stacked logs and overlapped them, but this left the structure vulnerable to shifting and drafts. The corners were the weak points, where cold air could infiltrate and structural integrity could fail. The solution was the notch. Scandinavian builders developed a variety of sophisticated techniques over centuries of experimentation. The Swedish X-joint, which appeared as early as the 11th century, created a strong interlocking connection. By the 13th century, this technique was well documented across Sweden, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge passed down from master to apprentice. But it was the Finns who became renowned for their exacting joinery. They developed the interlocking double notch, a complex joint that created an incredibly tight, draft-proof seal at the corners. This technique required not just skill, but an intimate understanding of wood behavior, how it would shrink, expand, and settle over time. A master builder could look at a freshly cut log and predict exactly how it would move over the next year, the next decade, the next century. This wasn't just carpentry, it was precision engineering, executed with hand tools, passed down through generations of master builders. The double notch was cut with such precision that when two logs were fitted together, you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. This precision extended to the logs themselves. While early cabins, known as pirti, were often built from simple round logs, builders soon discovered the superiority of hewn logs. By axing the logs into square or rectangular beams, they removed the outer sapwood, which was prone to rot and insect damage. The sapwood, being the youngest and most active part of the tree, contained more moisture and sugars, making it attractive to beetles and fungi. More importantly, the flat surfaces created by hewing allowed for a much tighter fit between the logs, minimizing the gaps that needed to be chinked with moss or clay. This created a wall that was not only stronger, but also a far more effective thermal barrier. Inside, life was simple but carefully organized. The earliest homes were a single room, perhaps 12 to 16 feet square. Floors were often just beaten earth, though some builders laid puncheon floors, logs split lengthwise and placed flat side up, for a more finished surface. These puncheon floors had the advantage of being warmer underfoot than bare earth and easier to keep clean. A fire built in a hearth without a chimney provided the only source of heat, with smoke escaping through a simple hole in the roof. This primitive system was later replaced by the stone fireplace with chimney, an innovation that came much later during the Middle Ages, probably in the 13th or 14th century. Windows, if they existed at all, were small openings covered with translucent animal hide or paper greased with animal fat. The grease made the paper waterproof, while still allowing light to filter through, creating a dim amber glow inside the cabin. Many families built sleeping lofts, if the roof was high enough, accessed by pegs pounded into the walls or simple ladders made from tree limbs. These lofts served double duty, providing sleeping space and storage for foodstuffs. The warmth from the fire below would rise, making the loft the warmest spot in the house during the long winter nights. This construction was remarkably efficient. A skilled team of builders working in unison could construct a basic log cabin from start to finish in just a few days, sometimes as little as a week. This ability to rapidly create durable, warm shelters was essential for the expansion of settlements into the harsh northern frontiers. The log house was more than a dwelling. It was a technology that enabled community, agriculture, and a permanent foothold in a landscape that had once been the sole domain of nomads. It was the culmination of centuries of refinement, an art form born from the axe and the forest. Part 3. For several centuries, during a period known as the Medieval Warm Period, which lasted roughly from 950 to 1250, the climate of the North Atlantic was relatively mild. Temperatures were warm enough that Vikings established settlements in Greenland and even reached North America. The building techniques developed by Finnish and Scandinavian craftsmen during this period were more than adequate for the climate. But the climate is not static. Around the early 14th century, the world began to change. This was the dawn of the Little Ice Age. From roughly 1300 to the mid-1850s, the North Atlantic region experienced a significant and prolonged cooling. Mountain glaciers advanced across Scandinavia, grinding down valleys and reshaping the landscape. Winters became longer, harsher, and more unpredictable. Average temperatures dropped significantly, and what had once been merely cold became life-threatening. The challenge of survival was amplified. The very definition of cold was being rewritten. Crops failed with increasing frequency. Rivers froze solid for months, cutting off trade and communication. The comfortable margins of the medieval warm period vanished. For the people of the North, the question became urgent. Were their homes, so carefully developed over generations, truly warm enough? Could the techniques that had served them for centuries withstand this new, brutal reality? To find the ultimate expression of natural insulation, we must look to Iceland. Settled by Norsemen who brought their building traditions with them in the 9th century, the island lacked the vast forests of Scandinavia. Faced with a scarcity of timber and the biting cold of the Little Ice Age, they perfected the ancient concept of the turf house, transforming it into a fortress of thermal efficiency. The Icelandic turf house, or torfbær, became one of the most thermally efficient structures ever built, using only natural materials. This was not simply piling sod against a frame. It was a skilled art, fine-tuned over centuries. Timing was critical. Builders would cut turf in late summer or early autumn when the soil was neither too wet nor too dry, and when the roots bound the earth most firmly. Cutting turf at the wrong time could result in blocks that crumbled or didn't bind properly. Builders used two main types of turf blocks. Angled wedge-shaped blocks, called klumbur, were used to knit the structure together, their tapered tails stretching across the wall's thickness to create internal bracing. Meanwhile, large rectangular glaumbær blocks, up to a meter thick, formed the main walls. These were laid over a stone foundation in a precise, interlocking pattern, often with strips of turf, called strengir, layered in between to create the strongest possible bond. Each block was placed with the care of a mason laying stone. The genius of the turf house was that it was a living structure. After the blocks were placed, the roots would continue to grow, weaving the individual blocks together until the entire house became a monolithic, weather-resistant shell. The sheer thickness of the walls, composed of dense soil and the insulating air pockets within its root structure, provided a level of insulation that was almost absolute. A well-built turf house could have walls over a meter thick, creating an insulating barrier that modern materials struggle to match. The thermal performance was astonishing. From the 9th to the 18th centuries, the main living quarters, or badstoffa, had no heating source other than the shared body heat of the inhabitants. They didn't need one. The earth-sheltered design and the massive turf walls kept the interior at a stable, livable temperature even as Arctic gales raged outside. The darkness of the interior, while seemingly a hardship, actually served a purpose. It helped preserve both foodstuffs and the timber framework. Smoke from cooking fires would permeate the wood, acting as a natural preservative against rot and insects. Even the windows were ingenious adaptations. Before glass became available in the 1800s, builders stretched sheep stomach membranes and amniotic sacs across the window frames, creating a translucent, waterproof barrier. These biological membranes were surprisingly durable and could last for years before needing replacement. Centuries later, as Icelanders began to move into modern timber and concrete houses in the early 20th century, many complained of the increased cold. The last known person to live full-time in a traditional turf house did so until 1992. Their ancestral homes, built from the very ground they stood on, had been warmer. While the pure turf house was an Icelandic specialty, the principles were not lost on the builders in Lapland. The lessons of the Little Ice Age were clear. Insulation was everything. Builders began to combine their mastery of log construction with the super-insulating properties of earth and snow. They built lower to the ground, minimizing the exposed surface area. They used the deep winter snows, packing it against the foundations and walls, understanding that a thick blanket of snow, full of trapped air, is one of the most effective insulators in nature. Snow can have an R value of up to 1 per inch, meaning a 3-foot snowdrift against a wall could add an R value of 36 to the structure. In the harshest regions, they would even bank earth or turf against the lower portions of the log walls, creating a hybrid structure that combined the best of both traditions. The wall was no longer just a wooden barrier. It was becoming a multi-layered system designed to hoard every precious calorie of heat. This adaptive response to climate change demonstrated the ingenuity of northern builders who refused to be defeated by the increasingly brutal winters. Part 4. To truly understand the genius of the Lapland cabin, we have to look beyond what is visible to the naked eye. Modern science reveals 2 key principles at work: R value and thermal mass. These concepts, though only named in the 20th century, were intuitively understood by builders for thousands of years. R value is a measure of a material's resistance to heat flow, its ability to insulate. A standard modern wall, filled with fiberglass insulation, might have an R value of around 13. A solid log wall, by comparison, has a relatively modest R value, typically between 1 and 1.4 per inch of thickness. A 10-inch thick log wall might only have an R value of 14. On paper, it seems barely better than a modern wall. But this number only tells half the story. It measures steady-state heat transfer, assuming constant temperatures on both sides of the wall. In reality, temperatures fluctuate constantly, and this is where thermal mass becomes crucial. The other, more crucial factor is thermal mass. This is the ability of a material to store heat. Wood, especially the dense, heavy timber used in log construction, has a high thermal mass. It acts like a thermal battery. During the day, the logs absorb and store heat from the fireplace and any ambient sunlight. At night, as the temperature outside plummets, the logs slowly release this stored heat back into the cabin, maintaining a stable, comfortable temperature long after the fire has died down. This thermal flywheel effect can reduce temperature swings inside the cabin by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The ancient builders of Lapland may not have known the terms R value or thermal mass, but they had an intuitive, experiential mastery of the concepts. Their entire construction process was a system designed to maximize both. It started with the selection of massive 20 to 25 centimeter thick pine or spruce logs, naturally dried for 1 to 2 years to reduce moisture content to between 15 and 20%. This seasoning process was critical. Properly dried logs would shrink uniformly, maintaining tight joints and preventing the warping that could create drafts. The cellular structure of pine and spruce, filled with tiny air pockets, acted as natural insulation, trapping warm air within the wood itself. It continued with the precision-carved, interlocking double notches, creating a corner so tight it was virtually airtight. This eliminated the single biggest cause of heat loss in a log structure: air leakage. Studies of modern log homes have shown that air infiltration can account for up to 40% of heat loss in a poorly constructed building. The finished double notch reduced this to nearly zero. Then came the chinking. Every remaining seam was meticulously packed with moss, a final seal against the wind. The Vikings had used it in the 8th century, and centuries later, it was still the most effective material available. The moss would be harvested in late summer when it was dry, then carefully pressed into every gap and crevice. Some builders would use specialized tools, carved wooden wedges that could force the moss deep into the narrowest spaces. The result was a wall that performed as a complete system. The hewn, flat surfaces minimized gaps. The double-notched corners created a structural and thermal seal. The moss chinking filled any imperfections, and the immense thermal mass of the logs themselves created a self-regulating heat reservoir. This was not just a wall, it was a sophisticated thermal engine built from the forest itself that allowed human life to flourish in a climate that should have made it impossible. Part 5. The age of the turf house and the moss-chinked cabin has passed. Today, builders have access to synthetic insulation, vapor barriers, and advanced materials that offer performance unimaginable to their ancestors. Spray foam insulation can achieve R values of 6 or 7 per inch. Triple-glazed windows can reduce heat loss to a fraction of what was possible with animal hide or even single-pane glass. Yet, the ancient traditions have not been forgotten. They endure. Across Scandinavia, there is a renaissance in log building. Modern architects and builders are looking back to the old ways, recognizing the timeless wisdom in their design. They build with massive logs, honoring the principle of thermal mass. They use modern versions of the Scandinavian saddle notch and the Finnish double notch, creating the same airtight corners, now cut with astonishing precision using computer-guided tools. But the fundamental principles remain unchanged. These new homes are a hybrid of ancient knowledge and modern science. They combine the thermal mass of traditional log walls with high-performance insulation in the roofs and floors, creating structures with R values of 38 or higher, far exceeding typical construction standards. Some modern builders are even experimenting with super-insulated half-log wall systems that can achieve R values of up to 72, while still maintaining the aesthetic and thermal benefits of traditional log construction. They prove that the principles discovered by ancient builders are not merely historical curiosities, they are fundamentally sound engineering. The revival of log building is not nostalgia. It is a recognition that sustainable, energy-efficient design often requires looking backward as much as forward. The story of the Lapland cabin is a testament to human ingenuity. It is a direct line of innovation passed down through generations. From the first people who learned to cover a frame with turf, to the Viking who first stuffed moss into a crack, to the Finnish master who perfected the double notch, each generation added to a collective body of knowledge. They learned to see the forest not just as a source of wood, but as a complete toolkit for survival. They understood that the earth beneath their feet could become their walls, that the moss on the forest floor could seal out the wind, that the snow itself could be turned into insulation. They engineered warmth from the cold. They built homes that were not just shelters, but were deeply connected to the environment, living, breathing structures that worked in harmony with the seasons. They mastered the art of super-insulation long before the science had a name, ensuring that even as the world outside grew colder, the fire of life within would continue to burn brightly. In an age of climate change and energy crisis, their lessons have never been more relevant.